In the void of space aboard the Plague Hulk, a massive ship corrupted by the rot of Nurgle, the Death Guard prepared for their next campaign. The ship itself seemed alive, its walls coated in the pulsating corruption of its taint. It was an ancient vessel, long abandoned by the Imperium, now repurposed as a mobile fortress for Nurgle's chosen warriors. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was thick with decay, both physical and spiritual, as the Death Guard, plagued by the unrelenting touch of Nurgle, prepared for their next mission. The ship was a place of suffering. The stench of rot and sickness was palpable in every corner, from the dank chambers where the warriors slept to the blood-stained training pits where they honed their skills. For the Death Guard, there was no escape from the agony of their cursed existence. They were living, walking corpses, each of them suffering from the disease that Nurgle had blessed them with. Their bodies were twisted, bloated with the gifts of their patron god, the once proud Astartes, now barely recognizable beneath their foul armor. Among them was Captain Typhon, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Death Guard. His armor was battered, scarred from countless battles, but the black rot-streaked paint still bore the insignia of his warband. Typhon was a veteran of the heresy, and his face, though twisted by disease, still retained some semblance of humanity. But that humanity was fading, replaced by the will of Nurgle, as the plague that coursed through his veins numbed his senses and drove him forward. He stood in the command chamber of the Plague Hulk, surrounded by his fellow officers as they prepared for the next phase of the campaign. The walls were lined with grim trophies, skulls, torn banners, and other gruesome spoils of war, each marking a victory in Nurgle's name. Typhon's hands trembled not from fear but from the constant gnawing pain of the disease that ravaged his body. It had been this way for centuries, yet he had never stopped fighting, never stopped serving his god. "Captain Typhon, the fleet is in position," said Lieutenant Viridian, one of his most trusted officers, his voice rasping as if choked by the rot in his own throat. "We await your orders." Typhon looked out at the fleet through the viewing ports, the vast expanse of Nurgle's ships stretching out before him like a dark plague spreading across the galaxy. Each ship was a fortress of decay, a symbol of their eternal war against the Imperium. The sight should have inspired pride, but instead it filled Typhon with something darker, an emptiness that had settled deep within him, the result of centuries of endless warfare. "Prepare the strike force," Typhon commanded, his voice hoarse but filled with the same conviction that had driven him to serve Nurgle all those years ago. "We move out in 1 hour. We shall strike at the heart of the Imperium for Nurgle's glory." The officers nodded in unison, and Typhon turned to leave the chamber. As he walked through the ship, he passed other warriors, hulking figures in plasteel armor, their once pristine suits now decaying and festering. Some were injured, their wounds festering with the same diseases that afflicted their bodies. Others were in the process of being repaired, their bodies slowly patched up with crude methods, but always returning to battle, always returning to serve Nurgle. Yet even as Typhon walked among his warriors, he felt the weight of his existence. It was a burden he could never escape. They all shared the same fate, living yet dying. Their bodies had been transformed by the will of Nurgle into something monstrous, a perversion of the Astartes they had once been. They were the Death Guard, and death was something they could no longer escape even as they fought for the eternal glory of their god. At that moment, Typhon's mind wandered back to the days before the heresy, before the plague had taken root in his soul. He had been a proud warrior of the Loyalist legions, a protector of humanity, a man of honor and duty. He remembered the camaraderie of his brothers, the shared battles, the victories fought for the Emperor's glory. But that had all changed when Horus rebelled and the galaxy descended into chaos. Typhon had been forced to choose between his duty to the Emperor and his loyalty to his brothers, and in the end, he had chosen loyalty to Horus. The day he had fallen was the day he had lost his humanity. The heresy had consumed him body and soul as it had consumed so many others. Now there was no escape from the madness that had taken root in the galaxy, and there was no escape from the disease that had transformed him into what he was today. 1,000 years of suffering, and yet we still fight, Typhon thought to himself as he passed through the narrow corridors of the Plague Hulk. We fight not for glory, not for honor, but for survival. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden tremor in the ship, a jolt that sent him stumbling. The tremor was followed by the shriek of alarms, and Typhon knew that the time for reflection had passed. The fleet was preparing to engage. The strike force would soon be launched. And once again they would march into battle not as heroes but as the cursed sons of Nurgle. Typhon's armor creaked as he stepped forward, his form a grotesque silhouette against the dim, flickering lights of the plague hulk. The stench of decay clung to him, the sour, rancid smell, a constant reminder of the plague's touch. But it was not the smell nor the feeling of sickness creeping through his veins that bothered him, it was the emptiness. His thoughts had long since grown distant, numbed by the perpetual presence of decay. The Death Guard had been fighting for so long that they no longer understood the purpose of their wars. The enemies they fought had become faceless, nameless things, their victories hollow echoes of past glories. They no longer fought for the Emperor's light or the ideals of the Imperium. No, they fought because it was what they knew, it was what they were cursed to do. Typhon's gaze fell upon the warriors around him, his brothers, his comrades, each one as decayed as he was. The Death Guard were warriors without a cause, without the shining light of purpose that once drove them forward. Their armor was a patchwork of rust and corruption, each piece bearing the mark of time and endless war. Some of them had once been men, sons of the Emperor, but now they were shadows of their former selves, their minds as poisoned as their bodies. The plague hulk, their ship, groaned as it moved through the warp. The walls vibrated with the rhythmic hum of the engines, and Typhon could feel the pull of the Immaterium. The Death Guard had long since learned to ignore the whispers of the warp, to shut out the maddening calls of the gods. But even now, as they drifted through the swirling darkness, Typhon could feel the warp pressing against him, a constant reminder of the twisted nature of his existence. A voice broke through his thoughts, the voice of his first captain, a bloated, towering figure of decay. Typhon, the captain's voice, rumbled deep and hollow like the sound of a distant bell. "It is time." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of centuries. The battle was upon them. The enemies of Nurgle would fall. Typhon nodded, though he did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The mission was the same as it had always been. To spread the plague, to bring decay to those who would resist Nurgle's will. But this time something felt different. There was a deeper sense of dread hanging over them, a feeling that the battle was not just a fight against enemies, but a fight against themselves. Against the endless hunger that gnawed at their souls. The Death Guard were not just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting to avoid something much worse. The Plague Marines, as they were now called, had been cursed to live forever. But what was eternity without purpose? What was immortality without meaning? The Death Guard had been at war for centuries. They had fought in every corner of the galaxy on battlefields forgotten by all but the most ancient of historians. They had fought for the Emperor, for the Imperium, and now they fought for Nurgle. But in the end, they had no real enemies left. The battles were always the same. Victory only to fall into the same endless cycle. Typhon's steps slowed as he reached the armory, the familiar weight of his bolter calling to him. He had been here so many times before. The weapons were the same, the armor the same. Everything was the same, and yet nothing felt the same. The meaning had been lost long ago. He was not the same man who had once stood in the Emperor's light, fighting for honor and glory. He was a broken thing, a servant of decay, doomed to fight for a cause he no longer understood. He strapped his bolter to his side and placed his helmet on his head. The fit was tight, the ceramite cold against his face. For a brief moment he could almost forget the rot, forget the decay. Almost. The ship shook as they dropped out of the warp. The chaos of battle beckoned, but Typhon's mind was elsewhere. He could feel the weight of his own thoughts pressing in on him. What was the point of it all? What was the point of the battle, of the endless fight, if there was no victory to be had? What was the point of serving Nurgle if there was no salvation at the end? The doors to the armory opened with a mechanical hiss and Typhon stepped forward into the corridor. His brothers were already there, their forms a mass of rot and decay. Some of them grinned beneath their helmets, their expressions twisted with the madness of their immortality. Others stood in silence, the weight of the years too heavy for words. Typhon looked at them all, but he did not see men anymore. He saw only the hollow echoes of the warriors they had once been. The battle began in a flash. Bolter fire erupted around them as the Death Guard charged into the fray. Typhon's bolter roared in his hands, the familiar sound of death echoing in his ears. But as the enemy fell one by one, Typhon could not shake the feeling that there was something wrong with this victory. The bodies of the fallen foes piled up, but the feeling of accomplishment was absent. The Death Guard had won again, but what had they really gained? What had they lost? He continued to fight his body, moving on instinct, the years of training and battle ingrained in his every movement. But as the enemy's bodies stacked higher and higher, his mind wandered. Victory was no longer a triumph. It was simply another step in the endless cycle of war. Typhon watched as one of his brothers fell, his body riddled with bolter fire. The warrior's armor was torn apart, but he did not scream. He had no need to. The Death Guard did not scream. They did not mourn. They simply continued moving forward with relentless, unstoppable force. The battlefield was a blur. Blood and gore splattered across the ground, the stench of death mingling with the ever-present rot. But for Typhon there was no satisfaction in the slaughter. There was no glory. There was only the never-ending march towards nothingness. Typhon dropped to a knee, his bolter raised. The battlefield stretched out before him, a sea of destruction. And yet in the midst of it all there was no joy, no triumph, only the weight of endless war. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push the thoughts from his mind, but they lingered, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. The battle was not over. The fight would continue, just as it always had. And Typhon, like his brothers, would keep fighting until there was nothing left. But for how long could they endure? For how long could they continue to serve a god who demanded endless war and suffering, knowing that they would never find an end? The battle raged on, but Typhon's heart was empty. The weight of rot had consumed him, and the emptiness of immortality was all that remained. The battle had ended, and the roars of war slowly faded, replaced by the hollow stillness of victory. Typhon stood amid the carnage, his bolter's smoking barrel hanging limply in his hand. The fallen foes, once so full of life and defiance, now lay in piles, their bodies mutilated by the fury of the Death Guard. The familiar stench of decay hung thick in the air, a constant reminder of the ever-present force that they had come to embody. And yet as Typhon scanned the field, he felt no satisfaction, no pride. The battle had been won, but to what end? He looked over his brothers, each one wrapped in the filth of their eternal existence. The Death Guard had no reason to celebrate. No banners would be raised. No medals or honors would be given. They fought because it was all they knew, and the plague god Nurgle demanded it. To be part of this legacy, to be born into this cursed fate, was both a gift and a prison. Typhon's mind wandered as he watched his brothers go about their tasks. Some began to collect the skulls of the fallen, as was their tradition. Others scavenged weapons, armor, and anything of use that could aid them in the next battle. They didn't need much, just what was necessary to continue the fight, to continue the endless cycle. The warriors of the Death Guard had learned to live without hope, for hope had long since been consumed by the rot that now defined them. They fought not for the Emperor, not for honor, not even for Nurgle's blessing. They fought because that was all they had left. Fighting was simply the act of existing. A Death Guard could never retire, never lay down his arms. To do so would be to wither and die. They had traded one kind of death for another. Typhon's eyes flicked to the sky, though it was hidden by the hull of the Plague Hulk. The stars, the planets, they were all the same. They had become meaningless in the context of war. Time itself had lost its meaning. The years bled together in a maddening blur. Centuries had passed, and what had they accomplished? Nothing but death and decay. The universe had long forgotten the Death Guard, their sacrifices lost to history. In the end, the only ones who remembered their glory were themselves, and even that memory was fading. The whispering began once more. It was a familiar sound, a low rasping hiss that wormed its way into Typhon's mind. The whispers of the plague god, always there, always beckoning. The voice was not spoken aloud, but felt within like a presence inside his skull, pushing him forward, urging him on. You are mine, Typhon. All that you were is no more. The words were heavy, soaked in the rot of Nurgle's influence. They were not cruel nor vindictive, no, there was something almost comforting about them. But that was the curse of eternal life and decay. The whispering rot that slowly gnawed at one's sense of self until there was nothing left but obedience to Nurgle's will. Yes, Master Typhon, muttered the words slipping from his lips before he could think. He wasn't sure if he spoke them aloud or if they were merely thoughts manifesting within his mind, but the effect was the same. His service to Nurgle was absolute. In the end, he had no choice but to obey. The horror of eternal life, of endless war, was something that the Death Guard had long learned to accept. What else was there? For a moment, Typhon considered the notion of choice. Did he have one? The idea felt foreign to him, an illusion long since shattered. He was Death Guard, the walking corpse of a man who had once been a loyal servant of the Emperor, now a servant of a different master. Nurgle's power flowed through his veins, his very being, a manifestation of the disease and decay that spread across the galaxy. But still, in the silence of his mind, a small flicker of resistance stirred. What if there was more to life than this? What if there was some meaning, some higher purpose? He pushed the thought away as quickly as it had come. There was no room for such weakness in his heart. The Plague God had seen to that. The cold, metallic voice of his first captain snapped him from his thoughts. "Typhon, gather your brothers," the captain said, his voice distorted by the vox. "We are moving out. The enemy will not wait." Typhon did not respond immediately. He simply nodded, a subtle movement of his head that barely registered. The captain was right, of course. The enemy was never far behind, and the Death Guard had their orders. The only thing that mattered now was the battle that awaited them. The next fight, the next conquest. For Nurgle's glory, Typhon turned his armor creaking with the familiar slow movements that had become second nature to him. His brothers, the warriors of the Death Guard, were already gathering, preparing for the next assault. The battle was not over. It never would be. Not for them. They moved like a single decaying force. Their steps were heavy, methodical, and yet they never faltered. They were a plague upon the galaxy, unstoppable, relentless. Each one was a disease unto himself, an infection that spread across the stars, leaving only death and rot in their wake. The plague hulk shook again, and Typhon could feel the power of the engines pushing them forward through the warp. The echoes of the immaterium reverberated through his skull, the familiar pull of the void, both terrifying and comforting at once. They were heading toward another battle, another planet to conquer. But Typhon knew deep in the hollow void of his heart that this was just one more in an endless line. The battle ahead would be no different from the others. It would be brutal, savage, and ultimately meaningless. The Death Guard would fight, and they would win. But what was the cost? What would they gain from it? More death, more decay. Was there ever an end to the suffering they had endured? Typhon's mind wandered as they moved deeper into the ship, past the halls lined with the remnants of forgotten warriors. Each face, each body, each piece of armor was a testament to the endless war that had become their lives. There was no going back, no redemption. There was only the ever-present pull of Nurgle's will, drawing them forward into the abyss. As the Death Guard made their final preparations for war, Typhon felt the weight of his existence more than ever before. It was a weight he could never escape. The rot was in his soul, and it was slowly consuming him. There was no salvation, no hope, just the Death Guard forever bound to the Plague God's will. And so Typhon moved forward, as did the rest of his brothers. There was no choice. There was only the war. Typhon's mind shifted back to the battlefield, though the battle had already faded into the past. As they moved deeper into the warship, he focused on the sensation of his footsteps, heavy and slow as they reverberated through the metal floors. It was as if he could feel the ship itself groaning in its eternal existence, much like his own body held together only by the will of Nurgle and the endless fight they were bound to. The crew around him was nothing but an extension of that fate. There were no more questions, no more struggles against what had been done to them. They were warriors forged in the fires of plague, death, and corruption, and they would not stop until their bodies could no longer bear the weight of their armor. The Death Guard had long since accepted their fate. What had once been warriors of the Emperor with a sense of duty and honor now wore the twisted faces of the Plague Marines, tired, diseased, and yet still strong in their relentless pursuit of war. Their armor was battered and worn, patched together from the remnants of countless battles, and their eyes, hidden behind the helmets, burned with the fire of Nurgle's undying influence. They had come to understand that their suffering was not just a punishment, it was a form of worship. The rot and decay that had infected their bodies were gifts from Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, who gave them strength in return for their unwavering loyalty. This understanding brought a sense of clarity to Typhon's mind, but not peace. He had no illusions of finding peace. Peace was for those who were not touched by Nurgle's plague. A distant klaxon echoed through the halls, signaling that they were nearing their destination. Typhon could feel the thrum of the engines, the intensity of the power pushing the ship through the warp, and the eerie calm that followed. The warp was a place of madness, of shifting realities, and yet it was a place the Death Guard had come to know better than the real world. For them, the Immaterium was a refuge, a place where time lost its meaning, and where they could escape the memory of what they once were. But even in the comfort of the warp there was a tension, a quiet, gnawing anxiety that something was waiting for them. Typhon could sense it in the air, the feeling of inevitability pressing down on him like a weight that he could not escape. The whispers of Nurgle were growing louder, but Typhon ignored them as he had learned to do long ago. The ship shuddered, and Typhon's thoughts were momentarily interrupted as they broke free from the warp. The Plague Hulk was now nearing its destination, a war-torn planet already shrouded in the gloom of an impending battle. Typhon could feel the energy of the impending conflict, the anticipation that stirred the blood of his brothers. Despite the suffocating weight of decay, there was still a hunger within them, a hunger for battle, for death, for the next fight to fill the emptiness inside them. They were warriors after all. That was the only thing that defined them now. The Death Guard had long since abandoned the ideals of their former lives, the loyalty to the Emperor, the sense of purpose that once drove them. All of that had been washed away by Nurgle's blessing. Now they were nothing but soldiers in a war that would never end, locked in an eternal cycle of violence and decay. The deck plates beneath Typhon's feet rattled as the ship prepared to land. The Plague Hulk had arrived at its destination, and the time for battle was upon them. Typhon could feel the pulse of adrenaline surging through his veins, even as his body creaked with the weight of the armor he wore. It was a familiar sensation, one that had long since become second nature. The Death Guard fought because they had no choice. It was what they were born to do. Typhon's eyes flicked to his brothers as they assembled, moving like a well-oiled machine. They were ready for battle, each one of them determined to carry out Nurgle's will no matter what the cost. Some spoke in low tones, discussing tactics, while others simply focused on their weapons, checking them for any signs of wear. For them, there was no time for reflection, no time for doubt. The war had a singular purpose: to conquer, to destroy, to spread the plague. Typhon moved toward the weapons locker, his hand reaching for his bolter. The cold metallic grip of the weapon was comforting in his hand, familiar in a way that nothing else could be. He checked the load, ensuring that his weapon was ready for the coming fight. But even as he did so, he felt the whispers growing louder again, this time accompanied by a deep, resonating hum that seemed to echo from the very depths of the ship. "The time has come." Typhon Nurgle's voice rasped in his mind, the words, "A familiar presence. The galaxy awaits your rot." Typhon's lips curled into a silent sneer as he finished preparing his weapon. The voice was ever present, ever demanding, but it was the only guidance he had now. Nurgle's will was law, and it was the only thing that had kept him alive, kept him from falling into the abyss of despair. "Yes, master," he muttered, not even sure if the words were his own. He had long since lost the ability to question. He simply obeyed. The final preparations were complete, and the ship's engines began to hum louder as the landing craft prepared to deploy. Typhon moved into position with his brothers standing in formation, ready to take the battle to the surface. The planet below was already a wasteland, a broken husk of a once thriving world. It was a fitting place for the Death Guard to make their mark. The atmosphere around them thickened as the shuttle doors opened. Typhon felt the rush of air as the landing craft descended, the distant sounds of battle already echoing in the distance. The time for contemplation was over. The time for war had arrived, and so they marched. As Typhon and his brothers disembarked, the world before them seemed like a forgotten dream: ruined cities, shattered walls, and a sky polluted with the blood of the fallen. The stench of rot filled the air, a familiar scent, but one that always seemed to sharpen Typhon's senses. It was a scent of victory, of conquest, of death. And as the Death Guard marched forward, he felt a grim sense of satisfaction that only those who had truly embraced decay could understand. The battle would not be easy, but it would be theirs. Typhon's fingers tightened around the grip of his bolter as he advanced, and the whispers of Nurgle became a steady hum in his skull. driving him forward as they always did. March on, Typhon, march on. The land beneath Typhon's boots was a decaying mess of twisted metal, shattered buildings, and the remnants of those who had once lived in what was now a dying world. As the Death Guard disembarked from the shuttle, they were greeted not by the sounds of a bustling city, but the silence that comes only from death. This was the world that Nurgle had touched, where the pulse of life had long since faded, leaving only the echo of decay in its wake. It was a place made for them, for the Death Guard, the champions of pestilence and entropy. Typhon's eyes, hidden behind his plague-ridden helm, scanned the horizon as his brothers moved to secure their landing zone. There was no excitement in their steps. There was no rush to prove themselves. This was a war they had fought countless times before, a war that had no end and no final victory. This was their fate, the never-ending cycle of conquest, plague, and death. The inevitability of it was something they had come to accept long ago. The rotting wind blew across the landscape, carrying with it the stench of decay that Typhon had long become accustomed to. It wasn't just the smell of death that permeated the air. It was the smell of Nurgle's blessing, a reminder that they were his chosen, his favored children. The corruption that had once been a curse was now a mark of their power, of their superiority over the enemies of the Chaos Gods. As they moved forward, the soldiers of the Death Guard spread out, each one following their assigned objective with a grim focus. There was no chatter, no banter among them. Words were unnecessary. The battle was fought in silence, in the space between heartbeats, and the silent understanding that they were here for one purpose only: to spread Nurgle's rot and claim the world for his kingdom. Typhon's mind, however, was not entirely on the mission. Even amidst the chaos of battle, a deep sense of introspection settled within him. He had been a warrior for so long, a servant of the Emperor before he had fallen to the Chaos Gods, but now he was something else, something far darker. The man he once was, the man who had known honor, duty, and loyalty, felt like a distant memory, a shadow that no longer had any meaning. He had been consumed by the plague, body and soul, until there was nothing left of the man who had once been called Typhon. But even in his current state, there was something that lingered inside him, something that was harder to shake than the rot that had claimed his body, a sense of purpose. He had embraced Nurgle's gifts, not just for survival, but because in his twisted, broken existence, it gave him a reason to continue. The Emperor had forsaken him, his brothers, his legion had fallen, and now there was only the disease, the plague, the death that he carried with him. He was a soldier in a war that would never end, a plague-bearer who would spread the rot until there was nothing left but a galaxy consumed by decay. As they approached the ruined city, Typhon could hear the sounds of distant gunfire, the high-pitched whine of lasguns and bolter shots echoing through the decaying ruins. It was a sound that brought no joy, no excitement. It was the sound of a war that had been fought for millennia, a war that had no victor, only endless destruction. The enemies of Nurgle were nothing more than obstacles to be destroyed, bodies to be added to his shrine of rot. The Death Guard had learned long ago that they could not rely on the strategies and tactics of their former lives. They were no longer the soldiers of the Emperor, bound by honor and discipline. They were soldiers of decay, driven by the plague that coursed through their veins. Their tactics were brutal, relentless, and unforgiving. There was no mercy in their hearts, no hesitation in their movements. Every step forward was a reminder of their purpose: to bring the rot, to spread the plague, to destroy all who stood in their way. Typhon's bolter roared to life as they entered the city, the booming shots echoing through the streets. His brothers followed suit, their weapons cutting down enemy forces with ruthless efficiency. The battle had begun in earnest, but even as they pressed forward, there was a growing sense of inevitability. They were not here to defeat an enemy. They were here to claim what was theirs. The soldiers of the Imperium, already shaken by the presence of the Death Guard, broke under the relentless pressure. They fought back with desperation, firing from behind barricades and seeking cover where they could, but it was all for nothing. The Death Guard did not need strategy or tactics. They simply advanced, crushing all in their path. The enemies who stood against them fell before them, their blood mingling with the filth of the city as the Plague Marines tore through their ranks. Typhon's mind drifted again, his thoughts turning inward as he surveyed the battlefield. It was a senseless massacre, but it was also a necessary one. The Imperium had forsaken them. They were now enemies of the state, cast out and exiled to the fringes of the galaxy. The Emperor's light had faded, and in its place the dark power of Nurgle had consumed them. They were no longer men. They were something else entirely. Something that could only exist in the dark corners of the galaxy where disease, death, and decay ruled supreme. As the battle raged on, Typhon's brothers pressed forward, relentless in their assault. The blood of the fallen filled the streets, and the city that had once been teeming with life was now nothing more than a tomb. The screams of the dying filled the air, but Typhon could hear no joy in it. He was numb to the suffering of those around him. There was no pleasure in battle anymore, only the slow, grinding march toward the inevitable end. But there was something else that lingered at the edges of Typhon's thoughts. A sense of duty, a sense that they were doing something greater than just spreading destruction. This was not just a battle for conquest, it was a war to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The Emperor had taken everything from them, their humanity, their honor, their brothers, and now the Death Guard would take it all back, for Nurgle, for decay, for the end of everything. As the battle continued, the whispers of Nurgle grew louder in Typhon's mind, urging him forward. He felt the presence of his patron, the Lord of Decay, pushing him to fight, to kill, to conquer. There was no room for doubt in his heart. There was no room for fear. There was only the endless, unrelenting march toward destruction. And so Typhon moved with his brothers through the decaying city, through the ruin, through the chaos. Each step was a step closer to victory, a victory that would never end. The world would burn, the galaxy would rot, and the Death Guard would reign supreme. It was their destiny, and it was a destiny they would not shy away from. Typhon's thoughts faded again as his bolter fired once more, sending another enemy to the ground. The battle would be long, and it would be brutal, but the Death Guard were relentless, and their work was only just beginning. The battle raged onward. The Death Guard continued their relentless advance through the ruined city, cutting down all who dared to stand against them. The echoes of bolter fire and the rattle of heavy guns filled the air, a constant reminder of the chaos that consumed the world. But for Typhon, the cacophony of destruction, the screams of the dying, and the ever-present stench of decay were all strangely familiar. They were the soundtrack to his existence, now the only sounds that truly mattered. They signified that they were fulfilling their purpose, a purpose that was now etched in the very fabric of their being. Typhon, as always, felt the pull of Nurgle's blessings coursing through his veins. The plague had consumed him utterly, transforming him into a being that was both human and something beyond human. His body was a testament to the power of decay, each wound, each scar a mark of his devotion to the Lord of Disease. Yet in the midst of this grotesque transformation there was no pain, there was only a quiet, disturbing satisfaction. This was his fate, and he had embraced it long ago. The city, now little more than a skeletal structure of shattered buildings and crumbling walls, seemed to reflect the state of the Death Guard themselves. It had once been full of life, full of hope, but like the legionaries, it had been eroded by time, war, and plague. The once proud structures were now reduced to nothing but husks, slowly collapsing under the weight of their own decay. Just like the Imperium, the city had once been strong, but now it was destined to fall, overtaken by the inevitable rot that pervaded everything. There was no stopping it. There was no turning back. The Death Guard, led by Typhon and his battle brothers, continued their unyielding march. There was no resistance now. What few survivors remained were scattered, their will to fight shattered by the overwhelming presence of decay and death that the Death Guard carried with them. The Emperor's loyalists, the last vestiges of the Imperium's hope, had long since fallen before the unrelenting power of the Plague Marines. But even as the battle raged on, Typhon's mind began to drift once more, pulled away from the carnage of the battlefield and into the dark recesses of his own thoughts. What was it all for? The endless war, the endless suffering, the endless spread of decay. They had been fighting for centuries, but for what? Was there an end to this madness, or were they doomed to repeat the same cycle forever? His grip on his bolter tightened as a wave of bitterness washed over him. The thought of the Imperium, of the Emperor's betrayal, of the brothers they had lost, it all stirred something deep within him, something buried beneath the rot and plague. It wasn't rage. It was something deeper, something more sorrowful. Typhon's mind, poisoned by the corruption of Nurgle, could no longer hold on to his past. His thoughts were clouded by the plague, but the remnants of his former self still lingered like the ghosts of the men they had once been. And in those moments Typhon wondered if there was any part of him that still remembered the man he had been before all of this. The Death Guard were no longer the warriors of the Emperor, but they were still soldiers, still brothers, still bound by something, even if that something was now nothing more than the rotting remnants of their once noble cause. The grim silence of the battlefield pressed in on Typhon as if the very air was suffocating him. The battle had become a blur, the enemy no more than faceless bodies to be crushed beneath the weight of the Death Guard's might. They were simply the next obstacle to overcome, the next to be consumed by the plague. But Typhon had seen enough of this. He had seen it all before. The endless push, the endless destruction, the endless decay. He had done this for so long that he could no longer remember the point, and yet there was no turning back. The plague had him in its grip, and there was no escape. Even if he could have remembered his old life, his old brothers, there was nothing left to return to. The Imperium was gone, lost to the void, and there was only the unending, unrelenting march of Nurgle's will. He had once been a loyal servant of the Emperor, but now he was a servant of decay. The city was all but claimed now. The Death Guard had destroyed all who had stood against them. The enemy was broken, scattered, their resistance crushed beneath the weight of the plague. There was nothing left but the quiet aftermath of battle. The dead littered the streets, their bodies already beginning to rot, consumed by the very same decay that had claimed Typhon and his brothers. Typhon surveyed the devastation, his helm turning slowly from one side to the other as he took in the scene. There was no joy in this victory, no sense of triumph. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had completed their mission, but even that satisfaction was fleeting, as the quiet whispers of Nurgle began to creep into his mind once again. The Lord of Decay was never satisfied, the work was never done, and as Typhon looked down at the battlefield he knew that this was only the beginning. The world would continue to rot, the galaxy would continue to burn, and the Death Guard would be there every step of the way, spreading Nurgle's blessings wherever they went. It was a never-ending cycle, a cycle that would continue until there was nothing left but decay and death. And Typhon, like his brothers, was a part of that cycle, a part of the rot that would consume everything. The battle was over, but the war would never end. Typhon turned, leading his brothers forward into the next phase of the conquest. They were ready, ready to spread the plague, ready to bring death, ready to claim this world in the name of Nurgle, because that was what they were born to do. It was their destiny, their eternal duty. The victory had been swift, yet the toll it took on Typhon was greater than any battlefield wound. The very fabric of his being, forged through the endless cycles of war, was unraveling, yet for all his suffering he was still alive. He had felt death's cold embrace too many times to count, but like the unrelenting spread of disease, it never took him fully. He remained a living testament to Nurgle's power, a champion of decay, a prince of plague. Yet the quiet gnawing in his soul, buried beneath the rot, had begun to stir again. In the aftermath of the battle, the Death Guard stood victorious, but their triumph was hollow. The plague had claimed the city. The skies above were thick with the stench of decay, a pall that hung over the land. Still, even as their enemies lay broken before them, Typhon felt no satisfaction, no sense of closure. This victory, like all victories, was merely another step in the endless cycle. The cycle of war, death and rebirth, where nothing ever truly changes. Typhon could feel the weight of it on his shoulders, the futility of it all. The only certainty in this grim existence was that there would always be another battle, another world to claim in Nurgle's name, another round of carnage to begin. But at what cost? The words of his once priest, the one who had served as his spiritual guide before the fall to chaos, echoed in his mind. Victory is not what you seek, Typhon. It is the peace that you will never have. The priest had been right, yet Typhon had dismissed those words long ago. The priest had fallen to Nurgle's rot like all others before him, his mind consumed by the inevitable decay. But the words remained. And now, standing amidst the ruins, the plague seeping into every pore, Typhon could not escape the truth that they held. As the Death Guard settled into the aftermath of their victory, their triumph fading into a suffocating silence, Typhon walked alone. The distance between him and his brothers grew with every step, and the oppressive stillness weighed heavily on him. His mind drifted. He no longer saw the soldiers around him, nor did he hear their mutterings, their ceaseless chants of gratitude to Nurgle. He saw nothing but the white void, a dark, yawning chasm that seemed to stretch out forever, an empty abyss devoid of meaning. In that void, Typhon could almost hear the whispers, the cold, cruel voice of Nurgle calling to him, urging him onward. But there was no warmth in the voice, no comfort. Just the endless drone of decay, as if Nurgle were amused by the futility of their existence, of his existence. "You are mine, Typhon," the voice whispered. "You always have been. And so long as you fight, so long as you bleed, you will serve me. There is no escaping it." Typhon had come to accept that truth. There was no escaping the plague, the decay, the endless cycle of war. There was only the duty to spread Nurgle's gifts to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. He had been born into this life. The Emperor had abandoned him, the Imperium had betrayed him, and now he was bound to this new purpose, one that could never be undone. Yet despite his resolve, doubt lingered. The white void that consumed his thoughts seemed to grow wider, deeper, pulling him into its grasp. What was the point of it all? Was there more to this existence than the endless cycle of conquest and decay? Could there ever be an end to it? Could there ever be a time when Nurgle's blessings would not be enough? These were questions that Typhon had never dared to ask before. But in the quiet solitude of the battlefield's aftermath, they rose to the surface. And as the Death Guard began their march toward their next conquest, Typhon found himself haunted by the same thought. He was a soldier of Nurgle. He was a Death Guard. His fate was sealed the moment he had turned away from the Emperor, from everything he had once known. But the white void was calling to him now, and despite the plague's grip on him, despite the rotting husk that his body had become, he could not help but wonder, what if there was more? The thought was fleeting, but it gnawed at him, threatening to break the surface of his mind once more. It was a thought that he would push aside, as he had done so many times before. The cycle was unbroken. The war would continue. The plague would spread. But for now, Typhon could not shake the feeling that something was changing. Something was about to break. And he, like his brothers, would be dragged along with it. The journey ahead was long. The next world lay in the distance, ready for the plague to consume it. But as they marched, Typhon's mind remained in turmoil. The white void continued to haunt him, a constant reminder that no matter how far they advanced, the Death Guard would never escape their fate. The victory had been swift, yet the toll it took on Typhon was greater than any battlefield wound. The very fabric of his being, forged through the endless cycles of war, was unraveling, yet for all his suffering he was still alive. He had felt death's cold embrace too many times to count, but like the unrelenting spread of disease, it never took him fully. He remained a living testament to Nurgle's power, a champion of decay, a prince of plague. Yet the quiet gnawing in his soul, buried beneath the rot, had begun to stir again. In the aftermath of the battle, the Death Guard stood victorious, but their triumph was hollow. The plague had claimed the city. The skies above were thick with the stench of decay, a pall that hung over the land. Still, even as their enemies lay broken before them, Typhon felt no satisfaction, no sense of closure. This victory, like all victories, was merely another step in the endless cycle. The cycle of war, death, and rebirth, where nothing ever truly changes. Typhon could feel the weight of it on his shoulders, the futility of it all. The only certainty in this grim existence was that there would always be another battle, another world to claim in Nurgle's name, another round of carnage to begin. But at what cost? The words of his once priest, the one who had served as his spiritual guide before the fall to chaos, echoed in his mind. Victory is not what you seek, Typhon. It is the peace that you will never have. The priest had been right, yet Typhon had dismissed those words long ago. The priest had fallen to Nurgle's rot, like all others before him, his mind consumed by the inevitable decay. But the words remained. And now, standing amidst the ruins, the plague seeping into every pore, Typhon could not escape the truth that they held. As the Death Guard settled into the aftermath of their victory, their triumph fading into a suffocating silence, Typhon walked alone. The distance between him and his brothers grew with every step, and the oppressive stillness weighed heavily on him. His mind drifted. He no longer saw the soldiers around him, nor did he hear their mutterings, their ceaseless chants of gratitude to Nurgle. He saw nothing but the white void, a dark, yawning chasm that seemed to stretch out forever, an empty abyss devoid of meaning. In that void, Typhon could almost hear the whispers, the cold, cruel voice of Nurgle calling to him, urging him onward. But there was no warmth in the voice, no comfort. Just the endless drone of decay, as if Nurgle were amused by the futility of their existence, of his existence. "You are mine, Typhon," the voice whispered. "You always have been. And so long as you fight, so long as you bleed, you will serve me. There is no escaping it." Typhon had come to accept that truth. There was no escaping the plague, the decay, the endless cycle of war. There was only the duty to spread Nurgle's gifts to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. He had been born into this life. The Emperor had abandoned him, the Imperium had betrayed him, and now he was bound to this new purpose, one that could never be undone. Yet despite his resolve, doubt lingered. The white void that consumed his thoughts seemed to grow wider, deeper, pulling him into its grasp. What was the point of it all? Was there more to this existence than the endless cycle of conquest and decay? Could there ever be an end to it? Could there ever be a time when Nurgle's blessings would not be enough? These were questions that Typhon had never dared to ask before, but in the quiet solitude of the battlefield's aftermath, they rose to the surface. And as the Death Guard began their march toward their next conquest, Typhon found himself haunted by the same thought. He was a soldier of Nurgle. He was a Death Guard. His fate was sealed the moment he had turned away from the Emperor, from everything he had once known. But the white void was calling to him now, and despite the plague's grip on him, despite the rotting husk that his body had become, he could not help but wonder, what if there was more? The thought was fleeting, but it gnawed at him, threatening to break the surface of his mind once more. It was a thought that he would push aside as he had done so many times before. The cycle was unbroken. The war would continue. The plague would spread. But for now, Typhon could not shake the feeling that something was changing. Something was about to break, and he, like his brothers, would be dragged along with it. The journey ahead was long. The next world lay in the distance, ready for the plague to consume it. But as they marched, Typhon's mind remained in turmoil. The white void continued to haunt him, a constant reminder that no matter how far they advanced, the Death Guard would never escape their fate. The quiet was maddening. After the violence and screams of the battlefield had subsided, the overwhelming stillness that settled over the Death Guard felt more suffocating than the rancid air of the plague-infested world they had just conquered. The distant cries of the remaining survivors had long faded, replaced by a deep, pervasive silence. Only the echoing footfalls of the plague marines reverberated through the hollow remains of the world, their armor creaking as they moved. The grim procession of Nurgle's soldiers was unbroken, a march without end. Typhon, like the others, walked forward, but his mind was far from the march. The weight of the Death Guard's purpose pressed heavily upon him, but his soul felt at odds with the path they tread. The presence of the white void had not left him, and it gnawed at his thoughts relentlessly. Was this all there was? The endless cycle of victory and suffering, decay and conquest? His footfalls echoed alongside those of his brothers, but Typhon couldn't shake the feeling that in some quiet corner of his mind there was a deeper truth he wasn't confronting. It was not a question of loyalty or faith in Nurgle. Those things had been settled long ago. He had given up his devotion to the Emperor in the name of plague and decay. He had embraced the god of rot and disease with all the fervor of a zealot, but still there was a part of him that had always wondered, even after all this time, if there was something more to their existence. Was there ever a chance to break free of the endless cycle, or had they all long ago been doomed to serve Nurgle without question? Typhon's thoughts spiraled as the Death Guard advanced deeper into the darkness of the warp. The familiar feeling of the ethereal void closing around them was unsettling. There was no escape from it. There was no way to outrun the eternal pull of decay. They moved through the endless warp storms where the very air itself seemed thick with the stench of death and rot. For Typhon, it felt as if time itself was distorting. Was it hours, days, or had they simply been lost in the endless tides of the warp, with no clear understanding of where they had been or where they were going? It was during this silent passage as they journeyed toward their next conquest that Typhon's mind wandered back to the Death Guard's roots. He remembered the time before, the glory of the legions, The battle for unity, the betrayal, the fall, the endless battle against the Imperium. Those days felt like eons ago, distant memories that were almost impossible to connect with his current self. But even through the fog of decay, the fragments of those old thoughts rose like distant echoes, pulling him back into the past. The war had not always been like this, had it? There had once been nobility in the fight. There had once been honor. Even among the most devout of his brothers, that purity had slowly been replaced by the rot. The corruption had seeped in, pulling them deeper into Nurgle's embrace, and now there was only the cycle, the conquest, the decay, the disease, the endless push forward. What were they fighting for? Was it simply to spread Nurgle's blessings to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, to overwhelm every world with the eternal plague? Or was there something more, something deeper than the endless agonizing cycle? They now found themselves in Typhon's heart, if it could still be called that, ached with the weight of these questions. The unsettling thoughts made him feel fragile, like the rot that had once taken his body had begun to claim his mind as well. He shook the thought away, refusing to give in to the temptation of doubt. It was a weakness, something he could not afford, not when the Death Guard were marching ever forward, their next battle already looming. The will of Nurgle was absolute. There was no room for hesitation, no room for weakness. There was only the spreading of the plague, only the fight. And yet, even as he clung to that conviction, the silence of the warp pressed in on him. The quiet seemed to deepen with every passing moment, as though it were the calm before the storm. For the first time, Typhon began to wonder if the real war, the war for his soul, was just beginning. Had he been so focused on the battlefield that he had missed the true cost of his servitude? The Death Guard marched on through the warp, their journey taking them closer to their next destination. Typhon could sense the tension in the air. The closer they got to the next battle, the more he could feel the familiar pull of Nurgle's blessing. It was intoxicating. The very idea of conquest, the thought of spreading disease and rot to another unsuspecting world, felt like a drug coursing through his veins. It was a high unlike any other. But at the same time there was something else beneath it, something darker, something that was beginning to crack the foundation of Typhon's resolve. A soft tremor passed through the ship, a ripple in the fabric of reality itself, as the warp storms grew stronger. The ship groaned, its hull creaking under the strain. Typhon barely noticed it. His thoughts were too far lost in the churning darkness of the warp, in the war that awaited him. But the tremors grew worse. A jolt shook the ship, sending him staggering slightly. His mind snapped back to the present as his battle instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. He looked around, but the other Death Guard were unmoved. They had all felt the tremors, but they knew better than to question the warp. They were soldiers of Nurgle, warriors who had embraced the plague and the madness that came with it. They did not question their fate, they simply accepted it. But Typhon could not shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The tremors were becoming more intense now, more frequent. There was something in the air, something that felt different. The ship's communication system crackled to life, a distorted voice coming through the static. Typhon's eyes narrowed. The voice was urgent, frantic. "Something's wrong," the voice said. "The warp is shifting. We're losing control." The words echoed in Typhon's mind as the ship continued to shake. It was a shift in the warp, something unnatural, something beyond their control. Was it a trick of Nurgle's will, or was it something else entirely? As the ship's engines roared in protest, Typhon felt a cold chill seep into his bones. Whatever was coming, whatever force was pushing back against them, it was something far greater than Nurgle's influence. The Death Guard had survived many battles. They had endured much. But now Typhon wasn't so sure. They might have met their match, and the thought filled him with a terrifying sense of anticipation. The ship continued to lurch, the tremors intensifying. Typhon's grip on his bolter tightened, his mind racing. What awaited them on the other side of the warp's ever-shifting void? Whatever it wasn't a part of Nurgle's design. This was something different, something worse. The Death Guard were prepared for battle, but they had never faced an enemy like this before. Typhon turned to his brothers, his voice a low growl beneath his helm. "Ready yourselves," he said, the words echoing in his mind. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, and they would never bow to it. The Death Guard stood motionless as the ship groaned again, its hull bending and creaking under the mounting pressure. The tremors were no longer subtle, they were violent, relentless, each one sending a shudder through the air like the death rattle of a dying world. The warp itself seemed to be pushing back against them, as if some cosmic force had decided that their march would no longer go unchallenged. Typhon's breath, though shallow and labored from the rotting effects of Nurgle's gifts, remained steady. His gaze remained fixed on the far-off horizon, a distant glow through the flickering of the ship's lights. But the trembling of the ship had drawn the attention of his brothers, and as their eyes met in the dim light, a sense of unease began to settle in. They had all grown accustomed to the throes of the warp, to the never-ending chaos that came with navigating its unpredictable currents. But this felt different. There was something far darker waiting in the currents of the immaterium, something that wanted to tear them apart. The ship lurched again, this time with such force that Typhon had to grab the bulkhead to steady himself. His mind sharpened as his enhanced senses heightened, allowing him to sense the unnatural disturbance swirling around them. This was no ordinary warp storm. It was too structured, too targeted. It felt like a calculated force actively pursuing them. Something had found them, and it was dragging them into its depths. "Prepare for impact," Typhon muttered under his breath. His fingers tightened around his bolter, its weight grounding him in the uncertainty of what was unfolding. His instincts screamed for action, to fight, to face this unknown threat head-on. But there was no clear enemy, no immediate target, no battlefield to rush toward, just the overwhelming, suffocating sense of impending doom. Suddenly, the ship's lights flickered one last time, then died entirely. The ship was plunged into darkness, the oppressive silence broken only by the hum of failing systems and the distant sound of the warp's raging fury outside. It was an unsettling kind of quiet. The kind that hung thick in the air, so dense that it seemed to suffocate the very breath from one's lungs. Typhon's brothers stood in eerie silence, each lost in their thoughts, their weapons at the ready, prepared for whatever came next. The battle-hardened soldiers of the Death Guard had fought through disease, plague, and unimaginable suffering, but this was unlike anything they had faced before. Then the distortion hit. It wasn't a single wave, but a series of staggered pulses that tore through the ship. Each pulse felt like a blow to Typhon's very soul. The air was thick with unnatural energy, and the fabric of reality itself seemed to stretch and twist. For a moment, Typhon felt as if the very essence of the warp was bending around him. It was a sensation that was both suffocating and exhilarating. It felt as though the warp was pulling them deeper into a new realm, into something more potent than the chaos they had come to understand. But beneath that exhilaration was a dark, gnawing fear, a fear that they were being led somewhere they were never meant to go. The ship trembled once again, this time with an intensity that threatened to tear it apart. A low, guttural rumble echoed from deep within the bowels of the vessel, vibrating through the floor, shaking the walls and rattling Typhon's very bones. His enhanced senses flared, catching the faintest whisper of something alien. He felt the presence of a vast, unseen power, a force that seemed to permeate every corner of the ship, and it was coming closer. "Brace yourselves," Typhon growled, his voice low and steady, but filled with a rare edge of anxiety. His brothers, ever the stalwart warriors of Nurgle, did not speak, but they moved into their positions with grim precision. They were ready, but what they were ready for even they did not know. Suddenly the ship lurched violently, throwing them all to the ground. Typhon's helmet cracked against the cold, rusted metal floor, his vision spinning for a moment as the world tilted wildly. His senses spun in the chaos, the warp pushing and pulling at his very being. Then, as if on cue, the ship came to a violent halt. The impact threw Typhon back to his feet, his hands gripping his bolter for support. The sounds of the ship's systems grinding and screeching were overwhelming, and the disorienting feeling of being trapped between realities clung to his mind. "Where are we?" a voice called out, one of his brothers. His voice distorted through the vox, his panic evident even beneath the layers of combat discipline. It was a question that went unanswered, not because there was no one to respond, but because they all knew the truth. They had no idea what was happening. Typhon reached up and activated his helmet's internal systems, his visor flaring to life as it ran diagnostics. A flood of data assaulted his mind, but the vital information he sought, where they were, What they were facing was nowhere to be found. All the systems were failing, the warp had overwhelmed their connection to the outside world. The sense of dislocation was all-encompassing. Typhon felt as though he was floating, disconnected from reality itself. And yet through it all, one thought burned brighter than all the others. Whatever force had caused this ship to halt, whatever dark entity had pushed them to this brink, was not of Nurgle's making. This was something else, something far more ancient, far more terrifying. A sudden sharp screech split the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal being torn apart. Typhon's hand instinctively gripped his bolter even tighter, his instincts screaming at him to react, to fight back. But there was no enemy to engage, no target to focus on. There was only the creeping sense of dread that filled the ship, the sickening tension that made every breath feel like it could be his last. Without warning, a thick, oppressive fog filled the corridors. It was not smoke, it was not gas. It was something else, something alive, moving through the very walls of the ship itself. Typhon could feel it pressing against his skin, invading his senses, corrupting everything it touched. The very air felt sickening, as if it was laced with something more than the usual stench of rot and decay. It was a subtle shift, but enough to rattle even the most hardened warrior of the Death Guard. This was no longer just a warp storm. This was an entity. And it was coming for them. The fog thickened, and Typhon felt an unnatural pressure in his skull, a weight that seemed to push down on him, forcing him to his knees. His body screamed in protest, but he could not resist. The pressure was too strong, too alien. It felt like it was trying to crush him from the inside out. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself, to focus on the familiar feeling of the decay that had always been a part of him. But it was harder now. The stench of rot was overpowered by the otherworldly presence that surrounded him. Through the haze, Typhon could hear the faint whispering of voices. They were too distant to understand, too fragmented to make sense of, but they were there, a constant hum beneath the roar of the fog. Something was watching them, something ancient, something alive in ways they had never encountered before. Typhon pushed himself to his feet, fighting the weight of the presence that sought to bring him down. His bolter was useless here, his armor felt insufficient. They were no longer in Nurgle's domain, they were somewhere else, somewhere worse. He reached for his Vox again, but the connection was dead. The ship was nothing but a broken shell adrift in a sea of unknowns. They were alone. Alone in the grip of something far worse than Nurgle's rot. Typhon didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain. The Death Guard had crossed into a place that was beyond their understanding. The warp had always been their domain, but this was something different. Something that for the first time in his existence made Typhon feel small, vulnerable, and that vulnerability terrified him. Typhon's heart hammered in his chest as the thick, oppressive fog pressed closer, curling around him like a serpent eager to strike. He could feel it in his bones, this malignant force pushing against him, suffocating him from every angle. His vision was blurred, his senses muddled, yet every instinct he had honed through countless battles in the service of Nurgle screamed at him that this was not just another storm of the warp. No, this was something far more ancient and terrible. Something that sought to unmake them. The Death Guard stood in eerie silence, their bodies strained under the weight of the unrelenting pressure. Even their enhanced resilience, granted by Nurgle's gifts, could not shield them from the full effect of the entity's influence. Their armor, rusted and weathered from years of warfare, seemed to groan in protest, as if even the metal itself was being strained under an invisible force. There was no comfort in the familiar rot of decay here, no solace in the diseases that were their gift and curse. Here in this place there was only discomfort, disorientation, and a growing sense of helplessness. Typhon's hand reached for the controls on his armor, but the display flickered and died before he could make any meaningful adjustments. The familiar hum of his suit's internal systems, which had always guided him through the trials of combat, was now absent. He could feel his pulse racing in his neck, but the sense of panic was not one of fear. It was something deeper. It was a helplessness he had never felt before, as though something was eroding the very core of his being bit by bit. His mind strained against the fog, but the voices that whispered from the void only seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It was as if the very ship itself had become part of the malevolent force surrounding them. The walls shuddered, vibrating with a deep, unnatural resonance. Typhon's senses flared again, but this time, instead of the familiar pulse of Nurgle's corruption, there was a feeling of coldness, a chilling presence unlike anything he had ever encountered. The Death Guard, long inured to the whispers of the warp, could no longer ignore the malevolence that suffused every inch of the ship. This presence was not merely a force they were being hunted, and it was far more dangerous than anything they had faced. Brothers, Typhon growled through his vox, though his voice was strained as though the very air around him was thickening with each passing moment. Prepare yourselves. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were not enough. How could they prepare for something they did not understand? How could they face an enemy that was beyond the fabric of the warp, beyond their comprehension, their bolters, their chainswords, their armor? None of it was enough here. They were standing on the precipice of something far greater than their mortal enemies, and the terrifying truth was that they did not know whether they could stand against it. The ship's lights flickered once more, their glow dimming before flaring back to life, casting long shadows across the once familiar, now alien hallways. The fog had settled thick and soupy, making it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet in front of them. The air was charged, hums of energy crackling in the stillness, but they weren't the usual bursts of power that came from the ship's engines. No, these were whispers of something more, alive. Typhon's breath hitched as he strained to make sense of the fog, his hand tightening around his bolter. His body tensed, every fiber of his being screaming at him to act, to fight. But his mind, still reeling from the ship's oppressive grip, struggled to maintain clarity. The ship, this forsaken vessel, had become a tomb, and the enemy, this unseen predator, had set its sights on them. Suddenly a voice broke through the thick air. One of his brothers, the warrior known as Severus, called out weakly over the vox. His voice crackled and spluttered as if even the communication systems were being corrupted by the unseen force. Typhon's helmet shifted the interface, flaring to life, to confirm the transmission. We're... Severus's voice cracked as if he were choking. This isn't the warp. It's something else. Typhon's stomach twisted. His mind immediately went to the one thing they had all feared deep in their hearts, the Eye of Terror. Could they be so deep in the warp that they were being consumed by something far older, far more powerful than any of them could imagine? His heart beat loudly in his ears, and for the briefest of moments he felt something in the pit of his stomach, a terror so raw and alien that it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Severus, hold on, Typhon barked into the vox, but his voice felt hollow. How could he hold on when they were all slipping into oblivion? A distant crash interrupted their thoughts, a loud bang that echoed from deep within the ship. It sounded as though something had been smashed, something massive, something alive. The fog pulsed with a malevolent thrum, the air vibrating as though the ship itself was trying to push them out. Typhon's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the warp they were in anymore. It wasn't just chaos, they were facing something beyond even Nurgle's power. Form up, Typhon barked, his voice stronger, now laced with urgency. We move now, brothers, we must stay together. Whatever this is, we face it as one. He could hear his brothers moving into formation, the creaking of their power armor, the soft hiss of their respirators breaking the thick, suffocating silence. The weight of their steps was the only sound, now the rest of the ship pressing in on them as if the very walls were closing in, threatening to crush them. But even as they began to move, Typhon couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if eyes, thousands of eyes, were upon them, unseen and unblinking. The oppressive presence continued to grow, the air thickening with the force of it pressing down on their minds and souls. He could feel his own resolve weakening, his will being tested like never before. This wasn't just a fight for survival, this was a test of everything he had ever known, and he had no idea if he or his brothers were strong enough to withstand it. Move, Typhon commanded again, forcing his mind to focus, pushing the thoughts of fear and doubt aside. They had no other choice. The only way out was through. They would face whatever this was, and they would either overcome it or die trying. They pressed on deeper into the heart of the ship, the darkness closing in around them, their bolters raised, ready for whatever came next. The voices in the fog grew louder, but they remained just beyond the edge of comprehension. Typhon's blood ran cold as he stepped forward, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavily on his shoulders. They were heading into the heart of the unknown, and the unknown Typhon realized was something that had been waiting for them all along.